Okay, so today is just a bunch of review, mostly, because I did not get a lot of response from people about what we should be covering today. There were some specific things that people asked about, but not a lot. So today we will be going through the various sections. I thought about, just coming up with a song and dance number, which is what you deserve, because, you were supposed to tell me what to do today. But then I decided that I would have a little bit of mercy. Because, my singing is okay, but the dancing you wouldn't want to see. Anyway, I thought I would start with a little bit of philosophizing. What is it that we are up to when we're doing what we do? And then moving from that to a review of the details of how we do what we do, hopefully with some questions at this point from you guys. Given that there will be probably little response from that, we will then have a group activity in which groups will come up with questions which will then be answered by other groups. Okay? So these are sort of two group activities. First one, you have to come up with a good question about frame semantics. And the second, you guys are going to try to answer among each other. Okay? So, what is it that we're up to? Well, the trouble with this enterprise, as with so many others, is that we're up to a lot of different things simultaneously. I know even within this class, we have people with a very linguistic viewpoint and a very computational viewpoint. And the whole point of this enterprise is to be compatible with both of those. It should also be compatible with the psychological viewpoint and all the other cognitive science viewpoints, anthropology, etc. Our goal is always that. Now, the people that are at FrameNet are linguists and computer scientists, mostly linguists. So that is where we hope that we've done the best job. But we always want to know whether we have not done as good a job from the sociological or the psychological or the philosophical viewpoint. So as I've mentioned before, I'm slow to respond to emails, but that doesn't mean that I don't read them. And if you ever have insight into how we're doing something wrong, either from a linguistic viewpoint or from especially any of these others that I have less access to personally, then I would not just value but treasure email about that from any of you, okay? So how is it that we can try to be consistent with all of those different fields? Well, first of all, we should concentrate on getting it right in the area that we are most competent in, linguistics or computer science. And the assumption of cognitive science is that all of these are really entangled. So that the more we get it right on the linguistic side, the more likely we're also getting it right in the other subfields. Let me give you a tiny little example. So if I am studying emotions cross-linguistically, which I am, then it's true that I need to worry about the psychological angle, even more than for some of the other things that we do in FrameNet, because pretty legitimately, psychology has put the flag at the top of the mountain that's labeled emotions and said, this is our territory, right? But it's also linguistic territory because, as psychologists themselves have said, the only way that we have access to people's inner experience really is what they say. We're starting to get some ability to do neurological scans and things like this, but how do we know what those neurological scans mean in the first place? How do we establish what pieces of the brain mean what? Well, by asking people what they felt or what kind of response they have to the stimuli that you're giving them to try to make their brain work. So linguistics is entangled with this problem top to bottom, what emotions mean. There are a lot of linguistic theories that say that the number of emotion categories is really small. There are a lot of psychological theories and philosophical theories that say that the number of emotion experiences, the basic ones, they're careful to say, is really, really small. Now, going back to the technique used by Berlin and Kay and Roche for figuring out what basic level categories are, even as linguists, we can immediately notice that there are problems. So if the basic emotion categories were, for example, as Paul Ekman would have us believe, fear, surprise, anger, sadness, happiness, and a couple others, depending on which publication he gives you, then we have to wonder, where exactly does frustration live? Okay? So from a FrameNet perspective, right, we're trying to handle all the emotion words. It's a very big frame. There's going to be a lot of other frames that are related to it. And we can take the psychological hypothesis as there being separate frames for each of those basic emotions, and then everything else should just sort of slot into them. Or at the very least, we should have some very clear, more specific frames that inherit from those. The trouble is that it's unclear whether anger means the kind of feeling that you get when somebody does something bad to you and then you want to hit them back, right? Or does it mean when you have something that you want to do and then you can't achieve it, either because somebody is stopping you or because something is stopping you? We can see that these are two pretty different categories, and even just with a little bit of introspection, we know that even though you might say somebody's angry for either one of those, they're really different experiences, right? And in fact, the typing of the frame elements is not even the same, because in one case, it's sort of a desire for revenge on a person. And in a person who has done something that you construe as intentional. It might not be intentional, but in order to be properly angry at them in this way, then you have to have the feeling that they have done it on purpose. And in the other case, you don't need any of that, right? So especially in English, if I say someone was frustrated, I'm emphasizing a different scene, one in which there is no implication necessarily that there is a person there. It could be a person. But at least I think most of us, the experience we have most often is that we get frustrated using the computer, trying to make technology work, or we have something else that doesn't involve people necessarily at all. Like you're trying to screw in something into your bookshelf, and the screw keeps breaking off, and then you have to pull it out with pliers, and something like this, I think, is the prototype for the idea of frustration. I think pretty importantly, at least in English, the most likely label for that experience is not anger. from an English speaker viewpoint, right? So to me, that directly argues against the idea that it's a basic level category, right? So the basic level categories are the ones that you're just going to use. You know, whenever somebody asks you, oh, what was that? What did you just feel? Then the basic level emotions are the ones that you're going to give in response. Well, it turns out that the ones that people give in response are in the hundreds. You just ask how somebody feels, and there are hundreds of words that you will give as response. And if you look at them from a frame semantic viewpoint, each of them has its own special set of circumstances. One of my favorite examples is disappointment. I love disappointment in particular because, especially if you're talking about the case of being disappointed in someone, which happens a lot if you know a teenager, then either you have to say it to them or their parents are saying it to them, because in general, you want the teenager to do good stuff and instead they do something else. Or if you don't personally know a teenager that you have this experience with, then you can remember back to probably when you were a teenager that people would say, I'm so disappointed in you, or whatever the Portuguese equivalent is, of course. And this word all by itself really presents a problem for even a basic level split between anger and sadness. Because the whole point of disappointment is that somebody did something that you think they shouldn't have done, which is like anger, but you don't want to punish them for it exactly. You just want them to stop. You want them to do the right thing instead. And you feel sad, I would say, more than angry, but either one of those labels is terrible. What you feel is disappointed. So one piece of evidence from other fields that is starting to confirm this way of looking at it, rather than the psychological view that has been dominant for a long time, is the fact that we've figured out that there isn't any simple mapping between these so-called basic emotion terms and chunks of the brain. So one of the reasons why people had held the simple hypothesis was, well, I mean, you know, there should be parts of the brain, and you don't want to have, 200 emotions, because then you would have to hypothesize that there were 200 distinct brain loci, and we already know that's not true. So maybe it's just a small number, and then, maybe 5 or 6 or maybe up to 10 brain loci, and that would make some kind of sense. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be working out either. There do seem to be pieces of the brain that are active whenever there is a particular kind of basic stimulus or response pattern. But there's not a region of the brain that lights up just for the whole complex of an emotion. So if you break emotions down into smaller pieces, pieces too small to actually be part of any word, then, things like, is there an intentional activity? Is that the stimulus? Was there something good or bad about that, either in terms of what the action was or the result? Words distinguish between those two things. Was there a goal on the part of the person feeling the emotion? Was that goal achieved or blocked? Right? So you can see that each of these little tiny dimensions, that's going to be a much smaller number of things, and in fact, that seems to be much more what is going to map onto neurology. And we're just starting to get there on the neurology side. And for my part, I think it's important that we as linguists see how our hypotheses are confirmed or not confirmed by people doing these other things. And I'm hoping that, if my dissertation ever gets read by people in psychology, that they'll at least, even if they don't believe me as a linguist, that maybe the fact that I'm pointing them to evidence from neurology, which they should at least a little bit, will help to change the models that mostly are dominant in psychology as well. So just to sum up from this little case study, what I think we're up to at all times is we're really trying to inform, in general, how it is that cognition works. And we might have very different reasons for that, right? We might want to make computers work well by having them actually be able to use the same cognitive models that the people using them have. Or we might just want to be able to teach a language, either first language or second language. Either way, it's really useful to know what categories are in there. Or we might want to do automated machine translation, right? There's many different things we could want to do, but the whole point is for us to drive in a direction where all of those things work together, where we're not making our job so specific that it excludes all the other possibilities. And I really hope that at FrameNet we're moving in the direction that's going to make that more possible. Okay? So I had some specific questions, and I'm going to move on to those. And then after the break, we're going to talk about what were the things that you got out of the class in an implicit way by having you come up with the questions and responses, okay? I'm just repeating that because some people have been filtering in, and I want people to start thinking about questions. Okay, so the specific questions were in part about the null instantiations. I don't know if people still have that question after Thiago's responses on the forum, or whether that's still an issue. But I can outline the null instantiation situation again. I also had questions sort of from a philosophical viewpoint. Why is it that we do full text annotation? And I'll address that as well. Hold on just a moment. And also a question about what it is that we're trying to do with metaphors, which I think is a good question because we're being funded to do it right now. Unlike a lot of this other stuff where we'd love to do it, but we don't actually have money for it. So I'll end with that one. Okay, first of all, just a tiny review of null instantiation. I think everybody should, after the last few days' lectures, understand what CNI is, constructional null instantiation. The whole idea of that is to indicate that there is a valent which is missing, but it's not the fault of the lexical unit, but rather something else. I don't know if we gave you a really good list of the circumstances for CNI. In principle, it's not a closed list, but the most common cases are, in English, imperative, we also have instructional imperative. So here you see that you have a subject that's missing in that case. In this case, you have a subject and an object. And in fact, it could be many other things which are missing. But whatever it is that's missing here, it has to be what you're giving instructions about. So it needs to be something you've just mentioned in, this is often called the recipe construction, because the most frequent case for it is in recipes. Okay? The generic construction, which lets you omit some argument. In English, it doesn't let you omit the subject, but it'll let you omit virtually anything else. And for lack of a better word, I will call this one indirect constructional null instantiation. So what I mean by that is, let's say I have a sentence like, the attempt to find emo was a flop. So find here should have an external argument. And it just happens that the control mediation is done by attempt, which, because it's a noun, all nouns in general allow constructional null instantiation of pretty much any argument they have. Usually the reason why I didn't list it separately is because usually this is covered under generic, the generic null instantiation, but that's debatable. I might want to separately say you have noun null instantiation here as well. But either way, you can see that find is supposed to have its argument supplied by attempt, but then there's a construction null instantiation of one of the other kinds that attempt exhibits, right? So the same thing would be if I said something like, right? Try to find him. And in this case, it's indirectly explained by the imperative construction that we have up here. Okay? There are a couple of other cases of null instantiation that we've talked about. I'm wondering if anybody can remember what they are. I will give you a clue that at least one form of construction null instantiation that we've talked about is not relevant for English, mostly. Any takers? Okay. You sure? This one's really a straightforward question, I promise. Okay. Portuguese has the property of omitting subjects pretty freely, and that's a different construction than any of the ones that we use in English. It's very straightforward, but every time you omit a subject in Portuguese, at least the analysis that was given in Spanish FrameNet for the same phenomenon was called, because it was so frequent, they gave a special label, ECNI, meaning external constructional null instantiation. Each of these could be given subtype names to actually tell you which construction it is that allows you to have the omission. But because it's not a lexical fact, that's the most important thing. We have one label for all of them. Okay? There are still yet other constructional null instantiation cases, but I'm happy to not talk about them Thiago has a question.
I really don't know if it makes sense for me to call the no subject a construction no instantiation.
Okay.
I would rather classify it as a definite no instantiation.
But it's not a lexically specific definite null instantiation, right?
Well, when you are omitting subjects and you are just using a verbal morpheme to tell who they are, it's usually anaphoric. So you have already mentioned it. It's available in context.
It's certainly available in context, whether or not you've mentioned yourself, for example.
And I think that, well, I really don't know. I have thought about it, whether we should or not call it construction. But the fact is that it's too optional. And it's governed by information status. It's not the case like passive, in which the construction no instantiation has a profiling role. You know, so when you have the no instantiation for the agent in the passive, that's because you want it to be less prominent than the patient or something else, or the undergoer or whatever. But in the sense of the thing like gostamos de semântica, like we like semantics without the we, I really find trouble in calling that a construction.
Okay, so I'm going to defend that analysis for a moment. So for me, this all goes back to the idea of making orthogonal components, making independent components of meaning that when you put them together, do the right thing. So the most important consideration for this is how, in the first place, do you represent what a basic lexical item, before it has been put together with anything else, what it wants from its subject. So at least according to us at FrameNet, the simplest thing to do is to say that it wants something for a subject that has fills a particular semantic role, right? And that's all it says. It says, I would want something that fills this role to be my subject for this valence. And if you do it that way, then it doesn't mean that it is a little bit different from null instantiation of the other kinds, because you haven't specified what form it was you wanted. You haven't said, I wanted a noun phrase. You haven't said, I wanted a sentence. So it is a little bit different from that viewpoint. But it is still the case that there is a requirement that something above the current lexical item say something about how that information is to be filled. The claim is that it is much more straightforward to handle the agreement constructions by saying that the upstairs finite clause building construction is the thing that actually does that job. From that viewpoint, we should say that it's null instantiated always, in a certain sense, because the subject is always outside of the control of the lexical item, except for the assignment of semantic role, which it does. So we've thought about doing it exactly that way, never annotating subjects, but that was extremely frustrating, because you do want to be able to connect up the semantic type information. And the only way we could figure out how to do that was by annotating subjects. Given that we annotate subjects, we essentially have to say, well, we have an orthogonal description of the grammar. We have the lexeme by itself, the bare lexeme without inflection, that always wants something to fill its subject. And the bare lexeme doesn't know anything about person and number and all those things. And then you have a construction which is going to govern it. The immediately dominating construction, whatever it is going to say something about how that role is filled. It could be generic. If it's just an infinitive or a participle by itself, then you might just satisfy it generically. If it's a finite context, then in Spanish and in Portuguese, you can satisfy it by adding the person morphology onto the verb. But either way, that's outside of the base lexical unit. Do you know what I mean? So it depends on whether you're analyzing the whole word or whether you're trying to orthogonally analyze the uninflected word and the concept of inflections as two separate concepts. And given that verbs all work the same way to the inflection, then it's very tempting to adopt the orthogonality approach, which is essentially, I would claim, what this is doing. Okay? Yeah. Okay. All right. I don't know how much of that reached everybody else, but I have hopes. And you still have my email if you have questions about it. Okay, so this is some of the constructional null instantiation cases. Thiago also mentioned passive, which is quite relevant. There's also middle. There's several other things. I think they're all listed in the book. Or at least all of the ones that we have acknowledged so far are written in the book. Then for everything else, we have definite null instantiation and indefinite null instantiation. What you should do first for definite null instantiation, the one that you should check first is definite null instantiation. Something is DNI only if it must be present in discourse. This has nothing to do with whether it is present in discourse. It doesn't have anything to do with whether it has an overt form in the discourse or not. It just has to already be understood in the discourse. So just to give an example that people often get wrong, one of the most frequent errors is to say that the ingestibles frame element of eat here is DNI. The reason why this is tempting is because I just mentioned dinner. It's right there in the discourse context. That's true. We know something about what you ate. You ate dinner. That's irrelevant. The fact is that I can use eat anytime without having to include this information. So I can say, no thanks, I just ate. And it doesn't have to mean that I ate a meal. It doesn't have to mean that I ate steak. And no one is going to worry about what the identity was of what you ate. At least not at the linguistic level. They might have their own psychological reasons for wondering. But the point is that this should be labeled INI because you can easily imagine contexts where eat would not require you to have mentioned the antecedent. Okay? Thiago has a comment.
Yes. I think that might be the question I think. Okay. Yeah?
Yeah, you sound
All
like
right.
you're there.
So I think that this one I'm just going to ask might be the question that people have been having about that. So I think that when you have a definite null instantiation, a DNI, we must be able to point out the item filling the category, and not only the category.
I think you should be careful when you're trying to differentiate those two things.
Yeah, because, for example, when you said
I mean,
already
are you
ate
claiming that this is a category or an item?
an item.
Yeah, I would say it is too. So I think that this is still, but I think this is still INI.
Yes, correct. I'm just saying that when you said I already ate, it means that you ate something.
Exactly.
But, so something, the ingestible, it's the category. And
Okay.
dinner would be the item.
Yep.
Correct? So the thing is that if, because I think that sometimes it's a little bit confusing to determine whether the lexical unit requires you to mention the item filling the frame element, or whether you just infer the existence of the frame element. So just correct me if I'm wrong. If you say something like, I don't know, for example, I don't want more chocolate because of more. I have already ate. So you would say that chocolate, sorry, the ingestible for eat would be a DNI.
No.
Because of more.
What's that?
You would say, I don't want more
Yeah. We still
chocolate.
wouldn't say it's DNI. Nope.
No?
No.
So I'm among people who doesn't understand the difference
Yeah,
between DNI
I was
and
afraid
INI.
of that.
Yeah.
The reason why not is because, confusingly, DNI is not a property of the exact sentence that you have. It is a property that can only be determined if you compare to other sentences that might have been. So it really is, you think of this chunk that you have right here, and you say, of that chunk, given everything else that we know, would it have to have mentioned the thing in the preceding discourse? And the answer is no. And because the answer is no, it's not DNI. That's the intention. The reason why we do it that way, just to be really clear, the reason why Chuck Fillmore recommends that we do it that way is because then you have a much more even property per lexical unit, right? We're always trying to figure out what are the dimensions, what are the fixed things that go together. Well, it turns out this way of thinking about DNI makes it a consistent property for a lexical unit. Whereas if we were using the criteria that you're talking about, then eat would sometimes take INI and sometimes take DNI, right? And so this is a very different idea than just, is it in discourse or is it not in discourse? It really is, would it have to be in discourse or does it not have to be? Now, I'm not saying that you have to annotate this way, but what I am saying is that if you annotate this way, then you get sort of cleaner valences, right? Eat ends up having one valence in which the ingestibles are INI. Arrive ends up having a valence in which the goal is DNI. Okay? So you were going to say something else?
I'm just trying to find some support in other linguistic theories. So if we take information status theory or contextual inference or this kind of stuff, I would say that DNI happens either when I have an anaphoric situation, so I have already mentioned something and comparing that lexical unit in other contexts, in other sentences, I would notice that I always have to mention
Yep.
something previously.
Yep.
Okay?
Just like he or she, you would always have to have mentioned before.
Yes.
Yep, it's the same.
But it can also be cataphoric
It can.
in the sense that it can be mentioned after the lexical unit.
Yep.
But if I compare, again, I will see that I have lots
Exactly.
of, for example, the name, the noun reason is very common in Portuguese to introduce the frame element reason
Yeah.
after it's used. So
Right.
something like the reason is, and then you have
Yep.
something for it. All right. Or if it's really available in context. So when you say things like, Ronaldo kicked the ball and scored, the goal, the target to which he kicked the ball is totally available in the
Yep,
context.
exactly.
Because if he scored, then of course he didn't kick the ball in the other guy's head
Yeah, yeah.
or something like that.
Yep. Well, both he scored a goal
Yeah.
in the goal. You know, all of the frame elements are DNI in a case like that. Yep. One of the classic cases is we won. So if I, turn to you and I say, "Oh my God, we just won," then we had both better know what game it is. We don't have to have mentioned the game, but we just have to know what it is.
Or in those cases when say we just arrived.
Yep.
And of course it's here.
Yeah.
So you have a DNI
Yep.
in all of those cases.
Yep. All of those are DNI. Almost everything else is INI. So most of the time, in fact, when you have a direct object that's missing in English, it's not true in other languages, it's an INI. If we move to Japanese, this whole set of concepts doesn't quite even make sense, right? These are shorthands for constructions, right? These labelings of CNI, INI, DNI, these are pieces of constructions that we're talking about. And in the case of Japanese, you can omit any argument which is definite for any word. So basically everything would be CNI. Now it would be CNI with a definite interpretation, right? So whenever we do any of these things, whenever we have a constructional null instantiation, that means that when we annotate that for that construction, right? When we put on our Constructicon hats and we are starting to annotate those things, that means they have some role that they then assign somehow. It should be DNI or it should be INI, or it should make reference to this person in discourse or something, right? Somehow they should specify it.
So just to give further examples, for the imperative CNI, I would have a DNI.
I would be more specific. I would say it's second person. So this one assigns the role to second person.
Yes.
Right?
And for the generic, of
Yep.
course, the thing that I saw is indefinite.
Yep.
Right?
So you assign it to indefinite.
Okay.
Yep. The instructional imperative, you assign it to metaphoric. Right? And these
Yes.
ones you don't know because you have to go to which construction it is that finally really is the one that is licensing whatever it is before you can figure that out. Okay?
Yes.
Okay. So this should make a little bit more sense, right? There's often a problem where people see that something has to have been mentioned in the previous discourse, and so then they say that it's DNI, but actually that's because there's another construction that's taking care of that, right? Don't do that. We're trying to factor out the components, and INI and DNI are supposed to only be used for lexically specific cases. Okay? All right, so hopefully we have clarified this particular unclarity. Hopefully.
just a piece of extra information. I will post text on the VLE about that. Okay? We can
Okay.
post the examples and
Yeah,
because it's so popular.
it's
No,
pretty popular.
among everyone. So
Yeah. You mean the wrong impression is so popular?
and there are lots of questions and the whole subject.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. It's true. So, in the end, when we have a good Constructicon that lets us say something further about these CNI cases, then everything ends up being grounded as something specific, some specific person, or in the other case, it's going to be something indefinite. Now, that will enable a computational system that uses this information to then figure out just sort of what are its instructions about how to find further information on the frame element. So with DNI, it's very straightforward. It knows, well, I need to look in the discourse. Mostly I'm going to look backwards. If that doesn't work, I'll look forwards. And after I do that, then I should actually know the filler of this frame element if I've done my job correctly. Of course, for the things which are just sort of given by context, like we won, right? Usually if I say we won, we haven't been mentioning the game overtly. We've been assuming the existence of the game, but we haven't been mentioning the game overtly anywhere near where I say we won. In a case like that, a computer is still going to have a really hard time. But at least it will know that it should know. So that if it needs to make some reasoning processes or something like that to do some more work, then it would have a priority list. It would have something to go on. With indefinite null instantiation, it should still do that work of looking around in the context to just see if there might be something that fills the frame element. Right? It might be there. But if it fails, then it says, okay, all I know is that it's something of this type. Right? And then it will take the type information from the frame element, right? The frame element should have some kind of typing. So in the case of ingestibles, it should be some kind of food. You don't know what else, but it's not going to be shoe leather, right? This is a standard difference between null instantiated items and overt ones. I can say I ate shoe leather. But I cannot, after I have eaten shoe leather, say, oh, no thanks, I already ate. To mean I already ate shoe leather, right? So that also explains some mysteries that people often have about, yeah, but how do I get the more specific information about the frame element from INI? Doesn't that mean it's definite? No. It just means that whenever you have an overt filler of the frame element, then you have an opportunity to negotiate between the prototype that EAT is looking for and whatever it is that the frame element actually seems to be calling for. But if you have no overt element there, then the only thing you have is the prototype that is provided by the lexical unit and its frame. And so that can make the class of fillers much more narrow. Okay. I think this horse has been beaten, as we would say, slightly differently encoded in English. Okay. I think we don't have any more questions about that. So, now I'm going to give a slight defense for why it is that we do what we do with full text. Grounded in the sort of philosophical discussion that I started with. So, for the people who really just want a lexicon from FrameNet, for example, people who are second language learners, they're really not interested in this full text annotation business. And we do get tons of questions about why the heck did you guys, quote, waste all this time doing this work, which really takes a lot of investment, right? Full text annotation per annotation takes much more time. And so from a sort of dictionary building viewpoint, it's kind of useless. At least that's their perspective. So there is an answer even from the point of view of lexicography, which is that doing full text annotation keeps us honest and makes us handle the most frequent senses of things, right? If you want this to be useful for second language learners, they're not going to be reading, you know, Michael's list of the rarest words in English. They're going to be reading a real text, and most of the time it's going to be a text that most frequently has the most frequent words of English. And as long as we don't handle those words, we're doing a disservice to those people. And it can be sort of hard to think, oh, what is the most frequent words? Oh, I don't know, I'm working on this frame. If you stick to the usual FrameNet methodology of go frame by frame and then move on to some related frame. If you keep doing that, then you might never cover the frequent things in a language. And in fact, if you look around in FrameNet, then some very frequent things have, like the verb to be, are listed only in very peculiar places. So be is listed in performers and roles. That is a frame which is about, you know, what actors do. So if I say Kate Blanchett is Juliet, the only thing which is carrying the information that this is about, you know, an actress filling a particular role is the verb to be. So, I mean, it's reasonable to put it in performers and roles, but that then has made people sort of wonder why the heck we don't have the other senses of be. And here we come to something that I don't want to spend a lot of time on, but in general, we have a policy of not annotating those things that seem to not carry very much meaning at all, except annotating them as supports. And we may in the future actually make what you could call virtual targets out of all of the support verbs that we have annotated in FrameNet. But we haven't done that yet, so people look around, they see that the verb be isn't there, and to the degree that we haven't made obvious that we have covered the most frequent senses with the support verbs, as well as some infrequent senses with the performers and roles frame, then we've done a bad job. People need to know what the meanings are of the most frequent words. There's also an argument from the point of view of automatic role labeling. So if I want to do automatic role labeling, what I need to know is how likely is it that this infinitival phrase that's sitting right here, right next to the verb give, that this fills this role, say purpose? Or does it belong to some other frame entirely where give has an argument with an infinitive? So how do I know? If I have these two frames, I have two valences. Let's say in FrameNet we followed our policy and gave 20 examples from each of these frames. And in both cases, this infinitive valence appears once as a purpose, in the other case as a tendency. There's a rare sense of give, so he gave to laugh, meaning he tends to laugh, or something like that. Very rare, super rare. So if I have an automatic semantic role labeling system, it needs to know if I have an infinitive next to give, which one is more likely? It needs statistics, right? If it has one example of each from FrameNet, then that doesn't give it statistics. But if we annotate full text annotation, then the natural frequencies will be much more obvious. Okay, got it. Okay, So for both of those reasons, those are both what you might broadly call sort of ecological reasons, right? There's an ecology of frames and valences and all these other things, and it's much more useful to know how frequent things are than to know the totality of what there is. Much more useful to me to know that there are a lot of ants than to know every species of ant that has ever existed in this area, right? Okay. Now we come to metaphor. I'm going to be pretty brief about it. I remain sketchy for all the reasons that I've said every time I've talked about metaphor, which is we're still negotiating how we're going to integrate with the metaphor project. And so it's hard for me to say anything very definitive. But it's pretty clear that if we want FrameNet to be useful for actually doing inferencing, we know that metaphor is very frequent in language. And so if I want to use FrameNet to do reasoning about what's going on in a text, I can't do it without a metaphor analysis. And this is not a phenomenon which is limited to literary works. You find it plenty in scientific works as well. So if I say, for example, that the cell wall has a proclivity for, that's a complex word, that might not be one that people know. Proclivity is a personality-based tendency. It's specific to things that have tendencies as a result of their personality. But you can use it metaphorically to talk about cell walls. I can say the cell wall has a proclivity to attach to wet surfaces. Okay? Now, if I said tendency, tendency is at least arguably not metaphorical, right? Tendency is just about what you expect things to do in general. But if I say proclivity, and I assure you, if you look in English articles about cellular biology, you will find that. It's a very sort of backgrounded, metaphor. But you should understand that, if we have put proclivity in some frame which is concerned with personality tendencies, that this scientist is not suddenly losing their mind and thinking that the cell has a brain and a personality, right? I mean, it's very straightforward for a human to know that, but if you want an automatic system to be able to do reasoning, it has to know that. There are other cases, like if I say that we have been on a long march of progress, which is usually something that scientists will say in the beginning part of their paper, talking about what has come before. Come before is also a metaphor. Then we need to be able to understand that there's not stuff moving around all over the place, right? As opposed to the part of the paper where they say that such and such molecule crosses the cell wall and enters the cell. It's not metaphorical at all. I mean, it's not talking about the situation that we usually talk about with crossing and entering and all these things. It's on a tiny scale, but as far as the lexical semantics goes, it will do just the right job. Okay? So that's the first thing. If you want to do an automated system, if you don't have some way of not just saying that something is metaphorical, but actually saying what the final meaning of the metaphor is, then you're really missing a lot. And you're missing much more than the people who do these ontologies for cellular biology realize. They don't realize how open their very technical language is, because all they see are the technical words. The other point is that we can't really understand how people understand language without handling the metaphor end of things. And we've known that for a long time. It's just not something that we had funding to do until recently. And it's also not something that you can do without funding. As in, it is really different. Annotating for metaphor, we haven't done a lot of it yet, but we have thought about it for many, many years because we thought approximately 10 years ago, no, 12 years ago, we briefly thought, oh, maybe we'll just annotate metaphor. And we went off and did some experimental annotation and discovered that this was something that would take a lot of time to get right and that we needed a specific project to do it. And now we have that project. And you will remain in the loop about what we do with that. But all I can tell you right now is that it's worse, more difficult than trying to annotate for 2 different frames simultaneously. Right? That would be one way that you could attempt to do this, but it's actually the question of how you count what you get. How do you extract this information and form categories for the metaphors and relationships among the metaphors has been what we have had all the arguments about, both when we were thinking about just doing this and now that we have funding. So that's it for metaphors. Now, I hope you guys are still thinking about what questions would be really good ones. They don't have to be ones you don't know the answer to. They just have to be really good questions. You could know the answer, you might not know the answer, but they should be things that if a student answered that question, you would know that they knew something about frame semantics or constructions or something else that we've covered in this course. Okay? So when we get back from the break,